because they're afraid of being caught up in the gossip.
What are they saying about you,
To be offhand that I killed my wife, and as the police know themselves, and you yourselves know, well, I was in Luton, take the kids to the pictures.
In 1981, Carol Morgan was murdered inside her shop in Luton. She was hacked to death by an unknown assailant who then fled the store with money. It has taken the police 46 years to convict her husband Alan Morgan, now 74 years old, from Brighton. And today he was sentenced to a minimum of 22 years at Luton Crown Court after a jury found him guilty of conspiracy to murder following a 9-week trial.
For conspiracy to murder your wife, Carol Morgan, who was savagely killed on the 13th of August 1981, almost 43 years ago.
The actual killer has never been caught, and the judge said in the sentencing that they don't know if the killer even still is alive, and only Alan knows what occurred and why he wanted his wife dead. Carol was killed in a sustained and frenzied attack on the 13th of August 1981, and it was proven in court that Alan sought to arrange the killing of his wife and financially profited as a result. Alan went on to live with Carol's son and daughter and a mistress who he was having an affair with at the time that Carol was killed. She also stood trial but was found not guilty of involvement in the conspiracy to murder. The investigating officer, Detective Superintendent Pricket, walked into the convenience store in 1981 on the council estate in Linslade. This was near Leighton Buzzard in Bedfordshire, and he saw Carol's body and he said it was the worst attack that he'd ever seen on a human being.
Involving huge numbers of officers, establishing, first of all, that this was a brutal murder. Secondly, that it was clearly a deliberate murder, and we established within hours, in fact, that Alan Morgan had got a cast-iron alibi.
On the day of his wife's murder, Morgan called the police, claiming to have discovered her body after returning from a cinema trip with the 2 children. The prosecution in the trial said this was a way of constructing a cast-iron alibi for when he paid a hitman to kill Carol, who was 36 years old at the time of her death. He wanted to make it look like a robbery at the convenience store, and the scene in the storeroom that the police were confronted with is very vivid in the officers' memory, even those that have retired and are no longer involved in the police.
This murder prompted a huge police investigation at the time, under the leadership of Detective Superintendent Pricket. An index card system was used to cross-check leads and inquiries, generating over 200,000 index cards and 6,000 actions. 1,204 suspects were interviewed and over 600 witness statements were taken. As a result of a witness seeing a man with 2 plastic bags getting into a green Ford Estate car, 28,500 vehicles were checked to see if that car could be traced. The very best forensic experts at the time were recruited to investigate the crime and try to identify the perpetrator. Despite everything that Mr. Pricket and his team of 60 or more detectives could do, the murderer was never caught. Only one person knows the identity of the murderer, and that is you, Mr. Morgan. That is the secret which you have harboured.
Morgan became a person of interest because he was a womanizer and had cheated on his wife and was also arrogant and bossy. The investigating officer, who is now 82 years old, said Morgan showed no concern expected from a man who had just lost his wife in a horrific murder. Witness testimony said they saw a man carrying a bag who left the scene and got into an estate car, and the police were trying to identify him but never did.
The identity of the person leaving the premises at 7 p.m, the man who was described by a number of people that saw him of having a piggy nose. The second point of the inquiry was to establish the relationship between Alan Morgan and Margaret, and because experience tells you that in a domestic murder, very often it's a partner that is involved in it.
The murder would become a cold case, and it was looked upon every several years and it was reopened in 2018. And it wasn't until 2021 when a woman called Jane Bunting came forward with information that would lead to the conviction of Alan Morgan all these years later. The witness, Jane, was only 17 at the time, and she spoke to the police in 2021 saying that she'd been taken to a pub in 1981, and she was asked by Alan if she knew anybody that would murder his wife. And Miss Bunting said that while she was at the former Dolphin pub in Leighton Buzzard, shortly before the murder, Mr. Morgan asked her whether her ex-boyfriend knew anybody who would kill Carol. She recalled him saying, "What about Danny Mayhew, who you went out with? He's a bit of a criminal, isn't he?" On Monday, the KC defending Mr. Morgan said Mrs. Bunting's defence position was that the meeting at the pub did not happen. He revealed Mayhew had carried out a robbery in 1981, 2 months after the murder. The defence also questioned why Jane had only waited 40 years to come forward with this evidence of a pub story. She said, "It was something that I thought about. This type of information to me, I did not know that it would be vital." She added, "I would have known that the police had interviewed Alan and Margaret and were unable to identify who murdered Carol, so I assumed that the police had excluded Alan and Margaret." When asked if it had occurred to her to speak to the police with the benefit of maturity, Jane said, "Yes, I did a couple of times and I checked to see, but the case was closed." Morgan was now a frail pensioner of 74 years old, and he was charged with murder alongside his wife, who wasn't convicted. The court heard the killer had never been identified, but they used a heavy weapon to cause the fatal injuries to the body and skull of Carol Morgan. The justice who sentenced Mr. Morgan said that he was very wicked and the brutality of the killing shocked anybody that attended the scene. He said only one person knows the identity of the killer, and that is you, Mr. Morgan. That is the secret you have harboured for 40 years, and the law has caught up with you, and you will be jailed for at least 22 years. The senior investigating officer Cole Foster from the Bedfordshire Major Crime Unit, now retired, said, "Seeing Alan Morgan sentenced to spend 22 years in prison, this would likely amount to the rest of his days behind bars. This is monumentous, and for over 4 decades Carol's murder was undetected, and nobody had ever been prosecuted for the involvement in the truly sickening act. Carol did not deserve to die for somebody else's gain, and she didn't deserve to be erased from history, and we are extremely pleased that we have finally been able to deliver justice to her family." Alan Morgan's actions have caused irreparable damage to those who knew and loved Carol, and she wasn't able to live her life to her peak. Now, all these years later, he will finally pay for cutting her life short in that moment.
Which to me is unprecedented when you look at the amount of effort that has gone into this investigation over that time. And the incident room ran for something like 2 years, between 1981 and 1983, and still no suspect was ever identified. You have to question whether that line of inquiry was right or whether there is something else that needs to be pursued.
There are still some unanswered questions, and I hope that Alan, as he contemplates life in prison, finally tells the truth about what happened to his wife and mother of the 2 children he raised as his own, so that we can also bring responsibility for the physical act of killing her and the person to justice. Despite a painstaking investigation that was run by Brian Pricket from 1981 to 1983, no one was ever convicted, and it lay on file until the 2018 cold case reinvestigation. It was the witness evidence, re-interviewing people, and also gathering more information from witnesses that didn't give information at the time is what actually cracked the case. In a lot of these cold cases, you will find forensic evidence and DNA developments are what really seals the deal, but in this case, it was just a witness coming forward, and it shows how important it is to make sure that during these sorts of cases they speak to everybody that is in the area or may know anything, because one bit of information could lead to that vital clue that could solve the case. DCS Pricket, retired, said, "I'm very grateful to the cold case team for talking up Carol's murder and making sure that the meticulous evidence that was gathered that ensured the conviction of Alan Morgan, and he would no longer be able to walk the streets for the rest of his life. The case has been a story of 2 generations of policing coming together and the detective work of colleagues over 4 decades. Apart from that, it's shown no murder investigation is ever closed, no matter how long and how much time has passed. This was a complex and unusual case, and not least because it dates back over 40 years and crosses modern lines of inquiry that include forensic analysis, CCTV and phone data that were not available then. The case we built up against Alan Morgan primarily relied on accounts of witnesses. Their testimonies including a new witness who stated that Morgan had asked her whether she knew somebody and would get somebody to kill his wife, made the case and demonstrates how the police can and will investigate crimes all these years later. So I thought this story was really interesting, and I look forward to hearing what the viewers have to say. And please don't forget to drop a comment, like, share and subscribe. And rest in peace to Carol Morgan. And thank you for joining me today. Peace.
Affair with Margaret Spooner and possibly other women. In due course, Margaret Spooner's husband, Michael, discovered the affair and confronted you at the shop early one morning. He warned you to stay away from his wife. Thus, by August 1981, there was a culmination of a number of matters. Your financial worries were growing, with no immediate way out, and you needed to make a decision as to where your relationship with Carol on the one hand and Margaret Spooner on the other was going. It is apparent that divorce was not a viable financial option, and on the jury's verdict, you decided on the alternative solution, which was to get rid of Carol by having her murdered. Her life insurance would clear the debt on the business, allowing you to sell the business and move north to start a new business using the proceeds of sale, and it further meant that you were free to continue your affair with and eventually marry Margaret Spooner. Accordingly, you arranged for Carol to be murdered when alone in the shop, whilst you took Dean and Jane to the cinema in Luton. Many witnesses stated how surprised they were that you did that when you were not known to be particularly close to your stepchildren or to have taken them out, at least without Carol also coming along, on other occasions. It was the prosecution case at the trial, and I find that the trip to the cinema was organised by you to give yourself an alibi for that evening when you knew that Carol was to be murdered. It also ensured that the coast was clear for the murderer to perpetrate the crime. You left Linslade with the children at about 5 p.m, and shortly after 7 p.m, a man was seen walking from 61 Finch Crescent carrying 2 plastic bags. It seems likely this was the murderer, although he was never identified. A door from the shop leads to a storeroom and the office, with stairs leading up to the family flat. There's a separate entrance to the flat from Stanstead Crescent, leading into a small hallway, with the stairs straight ahead, the door to the storeroom on the right, and the door into the shop premises on the left. Nobody saw the murderer enter the premises, but it appears likely that Carol was in the storeroom where the murderer proceeded to batter her to death using a weapon such as a machete. He is likely to have brought that weapon with him for the purpose of killing Carol. In the days before the murder, you had made a number of withdrawals from your building society account totaling £900, a large sum of money in those days for someone who was living on the financial edge, and it is likely that that sum was part of the payment for the murder. The murder was particularly brutal. Dr. Carey, the pathologist, stated that there had been multiple blows, probably between 10 and 15, some of which were inflicted whilst Carol was lying on the floor and may already have been dead. The damage was such as to have left parts of her brain and skull scattered around the storeroom floor. This seems to have been something beyond merely a murder committed in the course of robbery, although robbery of cash and cigarettes does appear to have taken place, but was a crime where the primary motivation was Carol's death, consistent with being part of an agreement or conspiracy in advance, of which you, Alan Morgan, were the instigator. You discovered Carol's body upon your return from the cinema with the children at 10:45 that night. It was a matter of pure fortune that the body was not discovered by one of the children, with the additional psychological trauma which that would have caused. This murder prompted a huge police investigation at the time, under the leadership of Detective Superintendent Pricket. An index card system was used to cross-check leads and inquiries, generating over 200,000 index cards and 6,000 actions. 1,204 suspects were interviewed and over 600 witness statements were taken. As a result of a witness seeing a man with 2 plastic bags getting into a green Ford estate car, 28,500 vehicles were checked to see if that car could be traced. The very best forensic experts at the time were recruited to investigate the crime and try to identify the perpetrator. Despite everything that Mr. Pricket and his team of 60 or more detectives could do, the murderer was never caught. Only one person knows the identity of the murderer, and that is you, Mr. Morgan. That is the secret which you have harboured for the last 40 years. The law has now caught up with you, and you must pay due punishment for your part in this crime. But the murderer remains at large, if indeed he is still alive. I've had read to me the victim impact statements by Pamela Smith, Carol's cousin, and Jane Scales, Carol's daughter. Pamela Smith describes the devastating effect upon the family of Carol's death, and particularly on Carol's parents, Charles and Nellie Palmer. They're both now dead, and so it is through Pamela that the impact of Carol's death on them is described. Carol was their only child. Dean and Jane were their only grandchildren. And they, Carol's parents, were understandably devastated by her death. That devastation was multiplied manyfold by what then happened in relation to their grandchildren. You, Alan Morgan, took the children away to the north of England, and as I find, induced them to write letters to their grandparents, saying that they had new lives now and didn't want any contact with their grandparents anymore. These were grandparents to whom they were particularly close, and as Carol says, it absolutely broke their hearts. As Pamela says, it absolutely broke their hearts. She says that those letters destroyed what was left of their world. I quote from her statement. They had lost their only child, and now they were losing their 2 grandchildren, and neither got over their huge loss. It was just tragic. It was really wicked of whoever made Dean and Jane write those letters to their grandparents. Truly wicked. There's only one truly wicked person who's been in this court, and that is you, Alan Morgan. Jane Scales, in her statement, has described the impact on her and on her family. First of the legal process, the arrest of the 2 people she thought of as mum and dad, and the trial, and secondly, of your conviction for the murder of her mother. As to the first of those, she says that the prolonged reinvestigation into her mother's death of over 4 years has had an overwhelming effect on her, her partner, and her daughter. It has opened up a number of emotional questions surrounding her relationship with her family, why they moved away, and why she and her brother stopped seeing their grandparents. She says that the investigation has made her question the truth around her mother's death, which she thought she knew and understood. She says, and I quote, "It made me feel as though my life has been a lie, and that the people that I trusted most in the world may have been capable of a terrible betrayal of that trust. Those doubts have, of course, been reinforced by the jury's verdict and your conviction. As Jane says, after Alan was convicted of conspiracy to murder, it caused me to face up to the fact that a jury had unanimously decided that he was guilty of being involved in my mother's death. The man that I had spent almost my entire life calling Dad has lied to me for my entire life. I'm struggling to come to terms with the reality of this, quite simply because it is just too difficult to comprehend that it could be true. I now have to go through a period of adjustment where I try to piece together what has happened to me and how I move forward with the rest of my life. Knowing that Alan is guilty of being involved in such a horrific trial and how much my mother suffered is very upsetting for me and my family. It has been an incredibly distressing and confusing period of my life that has made me doubt everything I knew about my mother and my step-parents. It is clear from the fact that you continue to deny your involvement in Carol's death, as described in the pre-sentence report, that Jane will not get any assistance from you in understanding what happened to her mother and therefore achieving any kind of closure. In sentencing you, I have read and taken into account the contents of the pre-sentence report. Given that you continue to deny your part in Carol's murder and take no responsibility for your involvement in the offence, it follows that there is no remorse which can be relied on in your favour. The author of the pre-sentence report says that throughout her interview with you, quote, there was no regret or remorse demonstrated, just vigorous assertion of how badly he had been treated by the whole process, end quote. She says that, quote, throughout the interview, he failed to recognise the impact of his action on others, particularly his first wife and her young children, end quote. So far as Carol's parents are concerned, I note the following passage in the pre-sentence report. Mr. Morgan took it upon himself to distance the children from their grandparents, claiming at the time he did not want the children involved in their grief. He claims he had never stopped them and blamed them, that is the grandparents, as they never made any attempts to contact him or the children. When describing this, Mr. Morgan had no insight into how the victim's parents may have been impacted by his actions, or how they would have felt after losing their daughter in most horrific circumstances. There was no empathy for them or any other member of the victim's family whatsoever. Mr. Morgan had lost all contact with them and was unaware of the family's whereabouts. Claiming to blame the grandparents for not making any attempt to contact you or the children is, of course, a grotesque distortion of the truth, as demonstrated by the statement of Pamela Smith, to which I have referred. I turn to sentence. As I have no doubt you have been advised, the mandatory sentence for an offence of murder is imprisonment for life, and the sentence for conspiracy to murder is also life imprisonment. My task, in addition to pronouncing the sentence of life imprisonment, is to set the minimum term to be served. In so doing, the law is clear that I must not pass a sentence greater than would have been passed had you been sentenced at the time of the offence, as provided in paragraph 10A to Schedule 22 of the Criminal Justice Act 2003. I also take into account the guidance published by the Sentencing Council entitled How Sentencing of Historic Offenders Works, which sets out the basic position where an offender is sentenced, which is that it should be according to the law at the time the offence was committed, not the law at the time when they are sentenced. In 1981, the tariff for the minimum term to be served by those convicted of murder was set by the Home Secretary after consultation with various bodies. In accordance with the decision in Sullivan and others, 2004, the best guide to what would have been the practice of the Secretary of State is the letter sent to judges by Lord Bingham, Chief Justice, on the 10th of February 1997, and I accordingly take as the starting point for a normal or average or an exceptional murder committed in 1981 the term of 14 years. I must then adjust that starting point to take into account the aggravating and mitigating factors. Mr. Panayi, King's Counsel for the prosecution, submits that although not in force at the time of your offence, the sentencing regime set out in Schedule 21 to the Criminal Justice Act 2003 can and should be taken into account. He suggests the correct approach is for the sentencing court to consider the sentence that would be passed for a conspiracy committed today by applying the Schedule 21 criteria and then making a nuanced and careful adjustment, if one is needed, to ensure that a greater sentence is not passed than would have been imposed in 1981. However, I do not consider that it assists me to have regard to the sentencing regime, and in particular the starting points referred to in Schedule 21. They represent starting points which are significantly higher than those which pertained in 1981, and such regard would risk my passing a sentence which is significantly longer than that which would have been passed in 1981. I prefer the approach advocated by Mr. Aylett. I turn then to the mitigating and aggravating features. The aggravating features I take into account are the fact that this offence was a planned killing which entailed an exceptional degree of planning and preparation. This included finding a person prepared to carry out the murder, finding a pretext to leave Carol alone in the shop premises by taking the children out to the cinema, ostensibly as a treat for working in the shop, an act which amounted to a cynical abuse of the trust which Carol placed in you as her husband, evidence of the unaccounted cash withdrawals which began on the 27th of July 1981, over 2 weeks before the murder, and the steps taken to ensure that the offence appeared to be a burglary, including leaving cash in the desk drawer as payment for the murder and ordering large quantities of cigarettes the day before the killing. Next, the fact that this was a killing for gain, whereby the insurance on Carol's life would clear the debt on the business and allow you to start a new life with Margaret Spooner in Yorkshire. The brutality of the killing, which shocked all those who attended the scene, incorporating the use of a weapon such as a meat cleaver. The fact that Carol was effectively attacked in her own home, the shop premises and home of the family all being in the same building, and Carol's vulnerability, being left alone in these premises that evening. So far as mitigating factors are concerned, the principal mitigating factors are your age and health. These include your physical frailties, your type 1 diabetes, your diagnosed dementia and memory loss. In your letter to me, you refer to your loss of vision in one eye, your crumbling spine, and your reliance on assistance. I understand how difficult it has been and will continue to be for you in prison, and I take all these matters into account, and also the fact that, in consequence, you will, in reality, be spending the rest of your life in prison. I've taken into account all that I have read and has been said by Mr. Aylett on your behalf. The time served on remand to be deducted amounts to 40 days. Although it is probably academic, I am enjoined to inform you that as soon as you've served the minimum term, which I'm about to specify, you will be eligible for early release by the parole board, but you will not in fact be released unless and until the parole board considers it safe to do so. If you are released, you will be subject to licence for the rest of your life. If you break the terms of your licence, you're liable to be returned to custody to continue serving your life sentence.